Hello, Swamp listener. I just wanted to say that your podcast is fantastic, and I hope it stays online for many more years. While listening to one of your recent episodes about unsettling encounters, a memory resurfaced from when my siblings and I used to go hiking. For some background, I live in Tucson, Arizona, and often try to escape the city's chaos on weekends. I love exploring desert trails, abandoned drainage systems, and my favorite, venturing into the Verde River basin to see the unique mix of desert wetlands. But I've since stopped going, and I doubt I'll ever return after what happened. It was a mild Sunday afternoon when we decided to hit the trails. I had just gotten my driver's license and was thrilled to finally venture out on my own. This time, though, I wasn't alone. My younger brothers came along, which turned out to be a blessing because the area had changed drastically since our last visit. As we walked down the rocky paths, I noticed the trash problem had gotten way worse. Empty beer cans, plastic bags, and all sorts of debris were scattered everywhere, drying under the harsh sun in the riverbed. In the past, we'd tried picking up trash, but this time it seemed hopeless unless we had a large cleanup crew. Further along, we saw a park ranger approach on another trail. She veered off toward a homeless man near a makeshift tent. He appeared to be rummaging through some garbage. After speaking with him briefly, she left, heading back up the trail. Meanwhile, the man wandered away, disappearing behind a pile of dirt. Nearby, another tent was set up, and its occupant was watching us closely. Feeling uneasy, we decided it was best to leave that spot and headed back toward the riverbank. Along the way, we found a crushed soda entrapping a lizard inside, a clear reminder of how pollution was harming the environment. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered this. Similar cans with trapped reptiles had shown up before. We carefully cut the lizard free before continuing. As we strolled along the riverbank, we stumbled upon another campsite littered with used toilet paper and human waste. Disgusted, we turned back, only to cross paths with yet another homeless man, this one washing himself on the opposite side of the river. At that point, we decided to return to the main trail. Back at the dirt mound where the first homeless man had been, my youngest brother, always the curious one, decided to climb to the top. "Hey, there's another tent down here," he called out. "Get down," my other brother warned, but the youngest ignored him and started moving closer to the tent. Frustrated, I whispered harshly, "Get back here." The acoustics under the nearby bridge amplified my voice. Instead of listening, he picked up a rock and tossed it toward the tent. That was the last straw. I climbed up, grabbed him, and pulled him back, pushing him aside. He was angry, but I wasn't about to let him provoke someone who might be dangerous. We decided it was time to leave. Climbing to higher ground, we passed several more campsites, many littered with old magazines and discarded needles. Then we encountered a tall, imposing man. He must have been over 6 feet, muscular, and not the kind you'd want to cross paths with. He glanced at us briefly before vanishing into the brush. Tension built as we noticed another figure following us from a distance. We veered off into dense, thorny brush to avoid confrontation. The area was a maze of tangled branches and makeshift shelters, but surprisingly, most appeared abandoned. That's when we heard it. Footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. "Did you hear that?" I asked my brothers. They nodded, trying to convince themselves it was just an animal. But the sound grew louder, heavier. Whatever it was, it wasn't small. "Run," I whispered. We scrambled through the brush, cutting ourselves on thorns as we tried to escape. The pursuer closed in, the footsteps growing faster and more frantic. We drew our pocket knives, ready for the worst. Suddenly, the bushes thinned, and we saw an opening ahead. Without hesitation, we bolted for it, climbing up a rocky incline. The moment we reached the clearing, the noises stopped. Whoever or whatever had been chasing us retreated into the brush. Relieved, We spotted a ranger's truck parked further up the trail. Though we felt safer, we didn't report the incident. Who would believe us? Instead, we hurried back to the parking lot, piled into my car, and sped away. That day marked my last trip to the Verde River trails, and I don't plan on going back anytime soon. I've always loved hiking, much like many others. Exploring the trails at the local nature reserve brought me peace. The thick woods, the melodies of birds, and the crisp air always seemed to lift my spirits. I lived in a mid-sized town, not a bustling metropolis, but the usual stressors of daily life were still there. Little did I know that one seemingly ordinary outing would change how I saw the natural world forever. It was a bright fall morning when I decided to venture out for a hike. The trees were dressed in vivid orange and gold, and sunlight filtered through the branches. I loaded up my backpack, tied my hiking boots snugly, and started on the familiar trail. Hiking alone didn't bother me. In fact, the solitude was like a form of therapy. After about 2 hours on the trail, I began to notice something odd. The forest had become eerily silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Still, the quiet gnawed at me, and my unease grew. Then, breaking the silence, I heard a low, guttural sound coming from the underbrush. It was quiet, but in the unnatural stillness, it was impossible to miss. My chest tightened, and my heart pounded as I strained to see what had made the sound. Slowly, I parted the bushes to peer inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing in the shadows, was something I couldn't explain. It had the body of a large canine, maybe a wolf or coyote, but its eyes were all wrong. They were unnervingly human, and its jet-black fur seemed to absorb the light around it. The creature locked eyes with me, and I felt a wave of icy dread. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, almost frozen. Stumbling over roots and rocks, I finally tripped and fell. Glancing back, I saw the creature was still there, staring at me, unmoving but somehow suffocatingly close. In that terrifying moment, a realization hit me. I'd heard of beings like this before. Stories on strange podcasts or creepy documentaries described creatures just like this, skinwalkers, beings from legend. The name echoed in my mind as I scrambled to my feet and bolted. I sprinted down the trail as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, I could hear it move. It was chasing me. The speed was otherworldly, and I could feel it closing in with every second. My breath came in ragged gasps as panic threatened to overwhelm me. Somewhere in my desperation, a fragment of a story surfaced in my mind. I remembered hearing that such creatures supposedly couldn't cross running water. Whether it was some spiritual boundary or physical limitation, I didn't know, but I decided to take the chance. Scanning my surroundings, I spotted a small creek up ahead. It was narrow but fast-flowing. With all the energy I had left, I sprinted toward it and leaped to the other side, landing awkwardly but upright. Turning back, I saw the creature hesitate at the edge of the stream. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows. My heart was pounding as I stood there, trembling. Before I could catch my breath, I heard voices, other hikers approaching. The sight of them gave me a sense of safety I hadn't felt since the encounter began. I quickly crossed back over the creek and hurried down the trail toward my car, glancing behind me every few steps. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot and locked myself inside the vehicle. That day taught me an unforgettable lesson. The woods may seem calm and inviting, but they can hide things beyond our understanding. Since then, I've never hiked alone again. To anyone who loves the outdoors, stay alert and be cautious. Nature's beauty can sometimes mask its dangers, whether they're natural predators or something far stranger. I've always loved hiking through the Central Peaks. How could you not? The fresh mountain air, towering evergreens, and stunning vistas never fail to amaze me. Today was no exception. As I ascended the trail, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm and serenity. That peace was abruptly shattered when I saw something I thought was long gone from these parts. A cougar. The animal was crouched low to the earth, its sharp eyes locked on me. My pulse quickened with a surge of panic. I'd read about what to do in these situations, but putting that knowledge into practice was much harder than I imagined. I remembered the advice. Make yourself appear bigger and make noise to drive it off. Summoning all my courage, I raised my arms high above my head, trying to look as large as possible, and started shouting and clapping. The cougar didn't flinch. Its gaze remained unbroken, its eyes cold and unreadable. Then, out of nowhere, it charged. Its teeth bared as it lunged toward me like a shadow come to life. I stumbled back just in time, narrowly avoiding its attack. My heart was racing as I realized this was no bluff. The cougar wasn't trying to intimidate, it was aiming to kill. I tried to retreat slowly, but it was too fast, closing the distance between us in moments. I could feel its breath hot on my face as it snarled, mere inches away. My chest tightened with terror, my heart hammering wildly. Attempting to back away again, I tripped over a rock and fell hard onto the ground. The predator saw its chance. A sharp pain shot through my arm as its teeth sank in. I screamed, hoping someone nearby might hear me, but the only response was the guttural growl of the cougar. I knew I had only moments to act. Desperately scanning the area, I spotted a hefty rock within reach. Grabbing it, I swung with all my strength, striking the cougar. It yelped in pain, loosening its grip just enough for me to scramble to my feet and start running as fast as I could. But it wasn't over. The cougar gave chase, its powerful muscles propelling it toward me at an impossible speed. Once again, I could feel its breath close behind me. After what felt like hours, I spotted a ranger station ahead. My legs burned as I sprinted for it, hope fueling my final strides. Bursting through the door, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air and struggling to explain what had happened. The ranger immediately called for an ambulance, and I was rushed to the hospital. My injuries included deep bites and scratches on my arms and legs, along with numerous bruises, but I survived. Considering the situation, I was incredibly fortunate. Later, I learned that wildlife authorities had relocated a young cougar to the area recently. It was likely still adjusting and, in desperation, saw me as potential prey. Despite this terrifying ordeal, I hold no animosity toward wildlife. Cougars, bears, and other predators don't frighten or anger me, even now. But I can't stress enough the importance of being prepared when venturing into nature. Always remain alert and carry protective measures like deterrent sprays. They might just save your life. I had dreamed about this trip for many years, ever since I was a young teenager who loved hiking with my buddies. When I first heard about the Continental Trail, I knew it was a challenge I had to take on, especially if I ever wanted to achieve the Triple Crown of hiking. So when the day finally came, I was thrilled to begin my journey. The breathtaking scenery of the American wilderness filled me with wonder and excitement. With my backpack loaded with supplies, I was ready for several nights of outdoor exploration. But as my journey continued, strange signs began to pop up, making me uneasy. Then, I stumbled upon something that chilled me to my core. After trekking for hours, I reached a clearing in the woods. At first glance, it looked like an ideal spot to set up camp. But as I moved closer, I noticed bizarre symbols and markings scattered across the area. These markings were different from the faint ones I had seen earlier. They were darker, more intricate, and disturbingly eerie. Some even appeared to have dried blood within them. There were strange, crude figures crafted from sticks and bones, standing ominously among the trees. The atmosphere was thick with an oppressive sense of unease. It felt as though I had walked into a site of rituals, completely alien and terrifying, like something out of a nightmare. While cautiously exploring, I saw a group of people dressed in long, hooded robes. Their faces were hidden, and they were chanting together in a language I couldn't understand. The guttural, rhythmic tones sent shivers down my spine. A deep, instinctive fear washed over me. I knew I needed to leave immediately. It felt like every horror story I'd ever heard had come to life. The moment I saw those hooded figures chanting, I knew I had to run. But before I could, one of them noticed me. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the figure began walking toward me with a chilling intensity in their gaze. Our eyes met, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I wanted to move, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The figure began speaking in a strange, incomprehensible language. The words felt unnatural, as if they were being forced into my mind. The longer they spoke, the heavier my fear grew. The rest of the group joined in, their voices rising in a haunting, synchronized chant. I tried to flee, but my body felt paralyzed, like invisible chains held me in place. As they came closer, their eyes seemed to glow faintly, and I knew I was in grave danger. My heart pounded as panic consumed me. Then, out of nowhere, a sudden flash of white light filled the clearing. When the light faded, the robed figures were gone. The eerie silence that followed was broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing and sobbing. I had been planning this adventure for months, and now that I was finally here, trekking through the depths of Pine Ridge Forest, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. The crisp air and the stunning beauty of the wild landscape filled me with excitement and freedom. My pack was loaded with all the essentials: a sturdy tent, food supplies, and the gear I needed for several nights under the stars. Hiking and camping had always been my passion, and being here felt like second nature to me. But as the evening light began to fade into twilight, I noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air grew noticeably cooler, and an unsettling feeling settled over me. The once serene woods now felt heavy with unease. A prickling sensation crept up the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were fixed on me. I tried to dismiss the feeling, chalking it up to nerves, but the longer I hiked, the more oppressive the sensation became. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided it was time to set up camp. I chose a small clearing and quickly pitched my tent. A small fire crackled as I huddled near it, trying to shake off the strange mood that had followed me all day. Crawling into my sleeping bag, I told myself it was all in my head. That reassurance didn't last long. As I lay there, I began to hear something moving outside the tent. At first, I assumed it was a curious animal, but the sound was wrong. Each step was heavy and deliberate, unlike any creature I'd encountered before. It was unmistakably human, yet I was miles away from the nearest settlement. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the pacing footsteps continued through the night, depriving me of any real sleep. By dawn, I was worn out but determined to keep going. Packing up my gear, I resumed my trek, hoping to shake off the lingering unease. But the footsteps returned, louder and quicker this time, echoing from all sides. A chill ran down my spine as I realized whatever was following me wasn't going to stop. I picked up my pace, my heart racing as the invisible pursuit intensified. The footsteps seemed to match my every movement, no matter how fast I walked. The sound surrounded me, along with heavy, labored breathing that seemed impossibly close. Whipping around, I searched for the source, but the woods behind me were empty. It was as if the pursuer was both there and not there, a phantom presence. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a full sprint, the pounding of my own feet mingling with the relentless sound of the unseen stalker. My lungs burned, and my legs trembled as I pushed forward. Suddenly, I tripped over a root, crashing to the forest floor. Lying there, gasping for breath, I felt an icy, damp exhalation against the back of my neck. I froze, waiting for whatever was behind me to make its move. But just as abruptly as it began, the footsteps ceased. The woods fell silent once more, broken only by the ragged sound of my breathing. Gathering every ounce of courage, I scrambled to my feet and hurried onward, never daring to glance back. To this day, I can still hear those haunting footsteps in my mind, a chilling reminder of the terror I felt deep in Pine Ridge Forest. Several years back, I left a small village and moved to a secluded valley nestled deep in a remote area, encircled by sprawling forestlands and a scattering of neighbors. It was exactly the peace and quiet I had been seeking at that stage in my life. At the time, I had been working as an EMT for about 5 or 6 years. My love for nature and my drive to give back led me to join a local search and rescue team. Although it was a small, underfunded organization, we had a surprising number of calls. Over my 9 years with the group, we were busy nearly every weekend from spring through early fall. Most of the calls stemmed from the network of poorly maintained off-road trails that crisscrossed the area, prime territory for ATV riders and dirt bikers. Inevitably, people got lost, injured, or stranded, and we would head out to track them down, provide medical assistance, and transport them back to safety. Sometimes we used helicopters. Other times we had to strap them onto a jerry-rigged stretcher pulled by an ATV. About 2 weeks after I joined the team, armed with little more than my EMT training and some basic survival skills, I got my first call. A group of dirt bikers from the city had lost one of their riders. Oddly enough, they had placed their least experienced rider at the back of their group of about a dozen people. The group had set off into the wilderness, but when they returned to the starting point several hours later, their rookie rider was nowhere to be found. They spent another 4 or 5 hours combing the trails themselves before calling for help. By the time the 911 call was made and we assembled a search team at the trailhead, at least 8 or 9 hours had passed since the rider initially went missing. We quickly divided into teams, distributed maps, and headed into the woods. I was paired with one of the most experienced rescuers and assigned an ATV. Our strategy was to search the perimeter trails first, a massive loop surrounding the area, before moving inward to tackle the maze-like network of smaller trails. This approach, a hasty search, involved looking for obvious signs of the missing person rather than conducting a systematic grid search. The trails turned out to be far more treacherous than I had imagined. Rocky, uneven paths that required real skill to navigate. GPS devices were unreliable due to thick tree cover and rugged terrain, and cell and radio signals were patchy at best. The maps didn't account for the countless unofficial paths bikers had created over time, leaving us to rely largely on instinct. By the 4th hour, I was utterly drained, covered in mud, scratched up from branches, and exhausted. During a water break, we caught fragments of radio chatter indicating that the missing biker's motorcycle had been found, but there was no sign of the rider. The location was just a few miles from us, so we headed there. When we arrived, we saw the bike abandoned at the edge of the trail. A short distance into the woods, we spotted the other search teams standing together. As we approached, we saw what they were gathered around: the missing rider. He was lying on his back, arms outstretched, his lips blue and his skin ashen. At first, his wide-open eyes seemed blank white, but a closer look revealed that they were covered in fly eggs. He had clearly been dead for some time. It didn't make sense. The man was in his late 20s, healthy, and had a fully operational bike with food and water. Why had he abandoned it and run into the woods? And what had caused his death? We wrapped the body in blankets, secured it to a stretcher, and transported it back to the trailhead, where the coroner was waiting. A week later, I ran into the coroner and asked about the autopsy results. The official cause of death? Cardiac arrhythmia brought on by extreme fear. Apparently, the man had died of fright, a concept I had always assumed was just something from movies. I've thought about that day many times since. What could have terrified him so much? Was it simply the fear of being lost in the wilderness? If so, why did he run deeper into the forest instead of sticking to the trail? Part of me wonders if he saw something out there. Over the years, I've heard plenty of strange tales about the woods and even experienced a few odd things myself. Maybe there's more to the story than we'll ever know. I am an enthusiastic hiker. Last year, I went on a hiking trip in the northern part of Canada for a week. Recently, while recounting the story to a friend, they suggested that I share it because of how strange it was. After some thought, I realized they might be right. Others might have had similar experiences. My significant other and a few friends joined me on this adventure. For privacy, I won't mention the exact location, but it was quite remote. We traveled in a large truck equipped with a covered bed and a crawl-through opening to the front. It was designed to hold skis, though we didn't bring any. It was a clear, crisp winter night, and we were in the back, attempting to play a game of Magic: The Gathering. We thought it was amusing, nerds playing cards in the middle of nowhere. A few beers were passed around, and we were having a great time. Suddenly, one of my friends, an avid wildlife enthusiast, shouted for us to look at something. We paused the game and peered out the windows. In the distance, we saw what looked like a moose or elk silhouetted against the snowy landscape. The sight was thrilling since it was the first animal we'd spotted during the trip. By the second day, we planned to camp on Wednesday and return to civilization the following week. A few hours into the drive, Dave, the truck's owner, pulled over for the night. Most of us were exhausted, but I stayed up, catching up on work. My job didn't allow for complete breaks, and I couldn't shake the habit of staying productive. About 20 minutes later, I thought I heard Dave speaking, but when I pulled off my headphones, I realized he was asleep. Everyone was. I glanced out the window but saw nothing unusual. The sparse trees cast faint shadows in the moonlight. Still, I felt uneasy. After 5 minutes, my spouse stirred awake and asked me to keep it down, though I hadn't made a sound. I decided to take over driving to occupy myself, did a quick head count, and started the truck. While driving, I caught sight of the same antlered creature in the rearview mirror. Its head was lowered, partially hidden behind a tree. It was dimly illuminated by the moonlight. Although it seemed odd, I dismissed it as just another deer and kept driving. We saw similar animals a few more times as we neared our campsite. Could have been the same creature or different ones, but something about it unsettled me. That night, we set up camp. Dave's truck had a rooftop tent he had designed himself, which turned out to be more of a headache than we'd anticipated. My spouse and I opted to sleep in the truck bed for comfort. Feeling restless, I decided to go for a walk while my spouse stayed behind to sleep. I carried a machete, which was more for clearing small branches than protection. After wandering for a while, I heard my spouse calling my name. I turned toward the sound but quickly realized it wasn't coming from the truck. It was deeper in the woods. The voice repeated, identical each time, like a recording on a loop. My stomach dropped. Panicking, I ran back to the truck and started it up, ignoring the fact that the tent was still attached. As I sped off, the antlered creature suddenly appeared, charging after the vehicle. It let out a guttural, otherworldly sound that froze my blood. My friends, woken by the commotion, banged on the roof, yelling for me to stop, but I couldn't. I barreled over a rocky stream, jostling everyone inside. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the thing stopped chasing us. We drove for another 5 minutes before stopping in a clearing. My friends climbed down, hastily packed up the tent, and demanded I keep driving. My spouse's face was pale and streaked with tears. She's easily scared by horror movies, but this was something far worse. We drove in silence until sunrise. Once daylight came, we finally discussed what had happened. One friend theorized it might have been a rabid moose, but none of us could explain the voice I heard or how the creature kept pace with the truck. Shaken, we decided to cut the trip short and take a safer route back, stopping at a few small villages along the way. Although the remainder of the trip was pleasant, we never spoke of the encounter again. To this day, I'm skeptical of the rabies theory. There's no way it explains the eerie voice calling my name or the thing's unnatural speed. If you ever venture into the wilderness, take precautions. You never know what might be lurking out there. Good night and stay safe. It was sometime in late summer, maybe September, when I decided to take a hike that would stretch until around 10:30 at night. I was feeling anxious about some upcoming deadlines, and walking in nature usually helped calm my nerves. There was a small parking lot near the trailhead I chose, and as I pulled in, there were only 3 cars parked. One of them was a battered old vehicle, covered in dents and dirt. Sitting inside was a man who looked to be in his late 30s, just sitting there, staring directly at me as I started down the trail. Roughly 20 minutes into my hike, I spotted him again. He was on a different path but paused to stare at me once more. His intense gaze unsettled me, but I decided to keep moving. As the evening wore on, the sky grew darker. By around 9 p.m., the trail was nearly pitch black, and I could only see by the light of my flashlight. That's when I heard leaves crunching behind me. I stopped, turned around, and shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound. To my surprise, there was no one there. Still, the uneasiness grew. Deciding I'd had enough, I started making my way back toward the parking lot. It was about a 30-minute walk from where I was, and I figured it was best to head out before it got too late. As I approached the edge of the parking area, I suddenly heard footsteps, fast and deliberate, coming up behind me. Instinctively, I began to run. Glancing over my shoulder, I caught sight of that same scruffy, disheveled man from before. He was holding a cloth in one hand and what looked like a small spray bottle in the other. My heart pounded as I sprinted toward my car, fumbling for my keys as I ran. Just as I reached my car, I managed to unlock it and dive inside. The man was right behind me, grabbing for the door handle just as I slammed it shut. Hands shaking, I shoved the key into the ignition and started the engine. Without wasting a second, I sped out of there. In my rearview mirror, I saw him chasing after my car, his figure fading into the darkness as I drove away. The last glimpse I caught of him was when he veered off and disappeared into the woods. As soon as I felt safe, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I don't know what happened after that, whether they found him or if he was still out there somewhere. All I can do is hope that whoever he was, they caught him before he could harm anyone else. Before I dive into the story, let me tell you that these events are real, and what I am about to share is no exception. My buddy and I decided to explore a fresh hunting spot. This location was about 6 miles from my cousin's cabin. To save time, my uncle drove us closer and dropped us off roughly 2 miles in, which shortened the hike but didn't eliminate it entirely. The trek was still demanding, but we wanted to get far enough into the wilderness so we wouldn't disturb the game. It was around 5:30 in the morning when we arrived and began our walk. As we moved along, I glanced toward the tree line and noticed a tall, shadowy figure standing there. At first, I thought it was just some oddly shaped branches or shadows cast by the early morning light. You know how the mind can play tricks, forming shapes that resemble people. I didn't mention it to my friend, chalking it up to my imagination. Not even 20 yards later, a sharp sound from the steep hill to our left grabbed my attention. I looked up and saw something I'd only heard about in tales. It stood at least 6 feet 6 inches or 6 feet 7 inches tall. Taller than me, and I'm 6 feet 3 inches. My immediate instinct was to duck behind a tree. My first thought was, maybe it's just another hunter out here. But then dread hit me like a truck. We were deep in the woods, at least 7 miles from the nearest paved road and far from anyone else's land. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I carried a .308 bolt-action rifle with a full metal jacket round already chambered. Turning to my friend, I muttered, "I don't care who or what this is. If it comes any closer, I'm not taking chances." We crouched there for about 5 minutes, watching as this thing slowly made its way down the hillside toward us, completely unbothered by our presence. As it got closer, I managed to get a better look at it. The figure was lanky but unnaturally tall. What chilled me to my core was the hat on its head. Then, as the first rays of dawn hit it, I saw the unmistakable fur and the long snout of a coyote. This wasn't just some hunter, whoever or whatever. This had draped itself in a coyote's hide. My blood went ice cold. My hands froze on the rifle. I couldn't move, not out of a lack of will, but sheer terror. My friend and I locked eyes, and I could see the same fear mirrored in his face. Finally, I snapped out of it, raised my rifle, and fired. The bullet hit its target, and the noise that erupted from the creature was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was a mix of a mountain lion's scream and an elk's bugle, a sound so unnatural that it made my skin crawl. Without waiting to see if it was still moving, we turned and made a break for the nearest trail. Felt like hours, but we finally reached the road and got out of those woods as fast as we could. Even now, years later, I haven't set foot in that area again. My friend and I still talk about what happened that morning, but we've never found an explanation. All I know for sure is that whatever we encountered wasn't human, and it wasn't something I ever want to meet again. I live in Sweden and have a small cabin in the countryside. For years, I've wanted to share this story. I swear I encountered something one day, something I'd describe as a creature out of myth. One autumn afternoon, 3 members of my family and I decided to take a long walk to a hilltop. We're all nature enthusiasts, so we were soaking in the vibrant colors of the season. Being someone who loves extended hikes, I was especially excited about this trip. As we walked, we noticed a hare darting away, fleeing from some other creature. It was massive, standing about 4 feet tall, but we only caught a brief glimpse of it. Shrugging it off, we continued on our way, chatting and enjoying the serene environment. Eventually, we reached the summit, and the view was breathtaking. But as I gazed across the landscape, I noticed something unusual in the distance. It was large, and as I focused on it, I realized it seemed like the same thing we had seen earlier. This time, however, it was holding something in its hands. Though I couldn't be certain, the object had the size and shape of a hare. The creature appeared to be muttering or chanting something under its breath. Then, suddenly, it crushed the animal in its grasp. The sound was awful. I gasped, both shocked and horrified. It was only then that I got a clearer look at the being. It had long, scraggly hair tinged with a sickly green hue and a huge, crooked nose. It was draped in a patchwork of animal hides, seemingly trying to shield itself from the cold. Hearing my gasp, it turned toward us, and its glowing yellow eyes locked on us. Then it let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound that reminded me of a dying goat mixed with the bellow of a moose. The noise was unbearable. Its mouth was filled with misshapen, jagged teeth, and on one side of its face, there appeared to be eerie carvings resembling weeping children. I felt my stomach churn just looking at it. In sheer panic, we bolted down the hillside, pushing past one another in our desperate attempt to get away. Since that day, I've been deeply unsettled. Occasionally, I think I hear its eerie chants or that horrible scream echoing in the woods near my cabin. Let this be a warning. Whether you're trekking up a hill or wandering through a forest, you may not be as alone as you think. Earlier this summer, in late June or early July, my cousin and I, both 14 years old, were spending time together in a small town in Mississippi. We often found ways to entertain ourselves, and one of our favorite activities was riding my golf cart around the area. It was something we did every time she visited, but it started to feel repetitive, driving the same loops around the neighborhood. That day, we decided to stop at a dry creek bed near my street. I parked the golf cart near the edge of a neighbor's driveway, one we both found a little eerie. We'd once heard strange sounds, almost like screaming, coming from their yard. Curious, we got out and peered down into the creek. A few planks of wood, weathered and scattered about 6 feet in, caught our attention. Feeling adventurous, we decided to climb in and explore. As we walked along the dry creek, the rustling of leaves nearby caught our attention. We shrugged it off, assuming it was just a raccoon or a deer. After walking about 30 feet, we noticed an opening ahead that looked promising. We thought it might lead to something interesting, so we kept going, even when the ground turned muddy and mosquitoes swarmed us. The annoyance eventually convinced us to turn back before it got too dark. That night, we couldn't stop talking about how unexpectedly large the creek was. The next day, we told my cousin's older sister about our adventure and decided to revisit the spot, which we had now nicknamed the Grove. This time, we came better prepared with sturdy shoes. When we arrived, the rustling sound from the day before returned, but it was louder and closer. We pressed on, hiking through the open area once again. The woods bordered our peculiar neighbor's property, so we stayed alert for anything unusual. Eventually, we reached another wet, swampy section. Instead of turning back, we climbed out of the creek and into the dense woods where the noises seemed to originate. In hindsight, it was a reckless decision, but curiosity got the better of us. Every step we took seemed to disturb something. Spiders crawled out from under leaves, adding to the eerie atmosphere. At one point, we stumbled upon a hidden stash, a plastic bag containing what looked like marijuana, surrounded by empty bottles and old, tattered shoes. Seeing those shoes sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to leave immediately, but my cousin insisted on continuing. A short distance later, we came across a fallen tree covered in a fresh pile of trash. I started heading back toward the creek when my cousin shouted, "I found something!" I ran over to her, and she pointed to a pile of bones scattered in the underbrush. At first glance, we thought they might belong to a small child, but there was no skull. They could have been animal bones, but our imaginations ran wild. As we examined the bones, the sound of heavy footsteps around us made us freeze. Suddenly, a figure emerged. What we saw was beyond horrifying. A man with long, matted hair and filthy, blood-streaked hands was crouched nearby, moving like a wild animal. To our immense relief, he ran in the opposite direction, but then he stopped abruptly behind a tree and turned to stare at us. Panic took over, and we bolted back to the golf cart without looking back. To this day, I refuse to go near that road or the creek again. My cousin and I never spoke about what we saw after that, and we certainly never told anyone else. I'm a 17-year-old guy named Aaron. I like to think I'm a pretty rational person, always in tune with my surroundings. Some might even say I'm a bit overly cautious, but honestly, it's probably those traits that allow me to share this experience. About a year ago, when I was 16, my friend, let's call him Ben, and I were riding our bikes on a remote and narrow dirt path in a secluded area of Montana. I'd rather not give the exact location, but the road was the kind you'd expect in the middle of nowhere. A narrow, dusty trail surrounded on both sides by thick, dense trees that seemed to close in the further you traveled. We often felt uneasy on these rides, but that sense of unease added a little thrill to the adventure. However, nothing could have prepared us for what happened that day. Like most teens, we never imagined we'd encounter something so terrifying. We had been biking for nearly 2 hours, stopping occasionally to sip water or snack on what we'd packed. Just the usual stuff. Normally, our breaks were uneventful, but that day, we avoided stopping as much as possible because we kept hearing strange noises in the woods around us. After almost 3 hours, though, we had to rest. We found a large log to sit on and parked our bikes beside it to catch our breath. After about 5 minutes, we heard a piercing scream, like a woman's cry, coming from the forest. It sounded far off, maybe 300 yards to our left. Being teenagers and wanting to prove we weren't scared, Ben and I decided to investigate. We wandered around for about 20 minutes, but we didn't see anything. When we got back, though, we found our bikes completely wrecked. The chains were broken, the tires slashed, and one of the handlebars was twisted and mangled. My stomach churned, and for a moment, I thought I might throw up. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe some random troublemaker had passed by. But then, before we could think much more about it, we heard a loud crack, like a huge branch smashing against a tree trunk. It was sudden and deafening. Slowly, I turned, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a creature standing at least 6 feet tall. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur, and its face had a long snout that extended down to its chest. Strange, wiry appendages dangled from its chin, and its small black eyes glinted menacingly. On top of its head were large, twisted horns that curled outward. Without a second thought, Ben and I bolted. We didn't look back, just ran as fast as we could, zigzagging to confuse the creature in case it followed us. I don't know if it chased us, but as we ran, we heard the most chilling noises, like a mix of a pig's squeal and an eagle's screech. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before and absolutely horrifying. Eventually, we made it to a more populated road and called my dad to pick us up. We didn't tell him the full story, just said someone had messed with our bikes while we were away. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I've stopped exploring lonely trails and stick to busy paths instead. But to that strange creature lurking in the woods, let's never meet again.